More than any other time in the past, we need to connect ourselves and children with nature and the environment. My name is Kevin O'Shea, and I'm an environmental educator who wants to connect all of you with a bit of inspiration. In each episode of the Nature Talks podcast, I'll talk to incredible educators, scientists, thinkers, and innovators who are connecting those around them to nature and the outdoors and inspiring new generations of environmental stewards. Hello there, everyone, and welcome to episode number 16 of the Nature Talks podcast. I'm Kevin, your host of this podcast, all about environmental education, all about climate action, environmental stewardship, taking care of the beautiful place we call home, this world of ours. And this week, I'm really excited to have a fantastic guest, someone whom I look up to, someone who I respect and admire so much, Kath Murdoch. Now, Kath was kind enough to take the time to come on our podcast. She's a very busy person. Now, I'm going to kind of jump into this right away. Now, a little bit about Kath, just from kathmurdoch.com.au, her bio. It says, Kath Murdoch is an experienced teacher, writer, university lecturer, and popular consultant who has worked for many years with teachers and students in schools around the world. She's authored 15 books and numerous articles, including the best-selling Power of Inquiry in 2015. And she is respected for her work in the field of inquiry-based learning. Now, if you are an inquiry teacher, if you work in the International Baccalaureate Framework, the IB, PYP, MYP, you know who Kath Murdoch is. If you are new to inquiry-based learning wherever you are, she's a name that if you don't already know, you will soon as you dive deeper into your journey into inquiry. And a lot of people out there who are educators who know who Kath is are definitely know her passion for inquiry-based learning, for connecting teachers and students with inquiry. But one thing a lot of you might not know is that Kath is also an advocate for environmentalism. She is an environmentalist. She is a naturalist. She is someone who has a deep passion for nature, for animals, for wildlife conservation. And she is someone who is very passionate about connecting herself, those around her, and everyone with the natural world, which of course makes her the perfect fit for the Nature Talks podcast. She has many of the same passions that I do. She loves birds. I love birds. She loves wildlife. I love wildlife. And we both want to connect everyone we know and don't know with the natural world because we want as many environmental stewards out there as we possibly can get. So everyone, sit back and enjoy my conversation with Kath Murdoch. Okay, folks, well, welcome to another episode of the Nature Talks podcast. And in this episode, we're going to be talking all about nature inquiry, building curiosity, with someone who knows a lot about inquiry, building curiosity, someone who is a fan of the nature, an author, an educator, someone I know a lot of you listening, well, you know who she is. Kath Murdoch, welcome to the Nature Talks podcast.
Thank you, Kevin. It's amazing to be here. Thank you.
Oh, well, thank you so much. And I'm very happy that you, when I reached out to you, you were available and ready to do this. And again, it's really exciting. It's exciting to reach out to people around the world who have a similar passion.
Absolutely. Thanks for your podcast.
Oh, well, thank you for listening and being here. Okay, so I'm curious. I want to start off with talking a little bit about your connection to nature. I've got a quote from you from your Facebook page from a little while ago where you had talked about visiting a place where you go each and every year to kind of recharge. And you mentioned that time in nature is the key to my creativity, my energy, and my inspiration. I'm wondering, what is your connection to nature and why is it so special to you?
Right. Gosh. I don't know where to start with that because it's so important to me. And it goes right back to my childhood. You know, I'm really fortunate that, I moved to Australia when I was little. I was born in the UK. And my parents, my mother in particular, was enamoured with the bush land here in Australia, we had a little place on the coast that we went to every weekend. So I feel like I was marinated in bushwalks and time on the beach and shell collecting and bird watching and flower identification. I can't say that as a kid I was like rapturously enthusiastic about every time it was like, we're going on an expedition. It was usually, oh, do we have to? But I now appreciate, of course, how much that early childhood experience has meant that as an adult, I need that. That's what keeps me sane. That's what actually gives me an opportunity, like I said in that post, to reconnect with the essence of me and actually the essence of my passion for inquiry. So I'll actually be heading down the coast because I've only got Zoom meetings today. So where I can, I try and these days I try and work a little more from there, just so I can get the smell of the ocean, the smell of the eucalyptus, the sound of nature versus the sound. I live in the inner city here in Melbourne, so you couldn't get a bigger contrast. So, yeah, I think it's important for my general well-being, but it's definitely important for my work, and I owe it to my parents.
Yeah, it's amazing how those things happen. The same with me. I mean, my parents, I don't want to say they came from big city. Well, you know, my mother did. My father came from a smaller city, but we ended up, I was born and grew up in a very rural area of Canada. And it's interesting that the connections to nature, those are only kind of upon reflection as an adult. I look back at how deep they were. But for me, it was just life.
Yes.
I grew up in a fishing town of less than 1,000 people. I mean, playing in the forest was just what you did because that's where people played. You know?
That's right. So you are immersed in it as a child. And I mean, we both know as we're talking that what we're saying now has huge implications for the way that we work with children.
Exactly.
Right? But I know we'll be getting to that. But those early childhood experiences and that just, yes, the assumption that of course you spend time walking through the natural environment. Of course, this is the world that you live in.
Yeah.
And then it becomes the world that you need to live in.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting because, you know, I think of my own family and my children are very much big city children. They were born in the city of Kobe, Japan. When my daughter, for example, was 4, we moved to Beijing. We were there for a couple of years and now we live in Shenzhen. We visit nature sometimes, but they're big city kids. And that kind of leads me to kind of thinking in this way. I've met a lot of educators over the years who are definitely big city educators and didn't have the upbringing that I had. So I'm wondering, like, what are your thoughts about the whole idea? Why should, and again, I'm throwing big questions at you to start with here, but why should children and adults be making, especially now, 2020, be making these deeper connections with nature?
Throw as many big questions my way as you like, Kevin. I love big questions. Again, a big question. I'm pausing because the answer is big too, isn't it? So I'm going to say that I've been involved in the environmental education movement pretty much since I was, since I was a student teacher. So one of the things, the mantra for environmental ed, the mantra is very much about, in order to care for the environment and in order to take real action, sustained real action for the planet, we need to spend time in it. So we always had this phrase, in, about, for. So if you are wanting to teach in ways that mean that children or even your own children, you know, working with kids, are going to care for the environment, they've got to spend time in it. They've got to be connected to it. It's hard to care about something you don't have a relationship with, and that's true whether it's a human being or a tree. So that we do a lot of work, and we hear a lot now about sustainability. That was a word we never used when I first started in this field. But of course, that's huge now. And I often sit around the planning table with teachers and they'll say, oh, you know, this next unit of inquiry, you know, it's really about the concept of sustainability. And I hear them talking a lot about reducing, reusing, recycling, and that's all super important. However, for me, it's about, well, none of that is really going to get traction unless the children actually understand why. So the interesting thing, one of my favourite things to do actually, whether I'm working with teachers or children, when they say, oh, it's really important to recycle, and I'll say, why? For the environment. Can you explain how that, what do you mean? They go, oh, well, just so there isn't any more rubbish. Tell me more. And they that if we don't have that understanding, that kind of cradle to grave understanding that the earth is the source of all our lives, that without a healthy environment, we don't exist. Without invertebrates, we don't exist. Without that we are deeply connected to a healthy environment for our very survival. And so the distance that exists between kids talking about recycling and why it is important to do that is vast. And I think it's also vast in many teachers' heads too, just not having that kind of, if you like, biological science understanding. And the reason that's important, you might say, well, it doesn't matter as long as they're recycling. But actually it's not sustained. So if you don't understand the why behind what you do, and the why has to be deeper than it's good for the environment, you've got to be connected to that purpose to sustain that extra bit of effort that it takes. So I think my big answer to your big question is it's more important than ever before, because obviously our earth is in a dire state at the moment, and we have to do everything that we can in order to protect what Steve Van Mater once described as this spaceship Earth that we are dependent on. So because we have to do more than ever before, we've got to invest in people's connection. We've got to make them both love and understand the very thing that is our life support system. It's that serious. It's that serious.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, well put, well said. Thank you. I mean,
little bit of passion for 7 o'clock in the morning.
Yeah. Well, hey, it's 5 o'clock here, but I can handle it. But no, that's fantastic. And it's a great way for me to start off the day, as I'm about to, in a few hours from now, see 22 kindergarten kids walk into my room. And that's my whole goal. My whole purpose is to connect them as much as I can. And it's not about a unit of inquiry for me. It's about an everyday thing.
Yes, absolutely.
That's the way I've always looked at it. Every day is sharing the planet. And it's interesting. We just had on a recent episode of the podcast, biologist Isaac Cohen, who was talking about urban biodiversity, and that's his big thing. And he mentioned that biodiversity is everything, and the more complex the biodiversity in a city, the more healthy the city is. And when that biodiversity crashes, you've got nothing but rats and mosquitoes, as he put it.
Yep.
So it's interesting, and connecting the kids with that biodiversity just on the schoolyard is so important. And which kind of, when we were talking or just kind of sending messages back to each other through Twitter DMs and stuff about this interview, one of the things that I've personally found, now I've been an advocate for environmental education most of my adult life, but I've recently started getting I'll say air quotes, piece of paper. I've recently started taking courses from a university in Canada on environmental education. And that's really kind of the impetus for me really bringing this podcast back and being passionate about it, because I want to do more. And one of the things that I have to admit, and maybe because I've had the fortune of being in an international education setting and working in IB schools for some time, the concept of inquiry is something I've been kind of up to my neck in for a long time. But a lot of other educators don't have that opportunity. So even my cohort, my last class I took, some of the wonderful educators from Canada who were in my group were often saying, as we talked about inquiry, what is this inquiry stuff? I can't get my head around this stuff. It's so confusing. Because we were talking about that nature inquiry, that outdoors inquiry. Again, I love throwing these big questions at you and not giving you a lot of time to answer them. But what would you say to these teachers who may have been in the classroom for some time and now they're being asked to take kids outdoors in an environmental kind of reason? What would you say to them if they can't get their head around this inquiry stuff? in a nutshell. Boom.
And are these drops mic, walks away.
Yeah, there you go.
Gosh, in a moment. So I would find it really intriguing if there were teachers that were passionate about nature and getting kids outdoors that found it difficult to wrap their head around inquiry, because I think the most natural context to see inquiry happening is indeed the outdoors, right? You see it and maybe it's more a matter of overthinking that. I would be saying to those teachers, let's take your kids outside. Let's watch what happens. You know, ideally, let's take them into somewhere that's got some biodiversity, a reasonably rich natural environment. Now, let's watch. And I'd be saying to them, see that? That's inquiry. See that kid there lifting the bark off the tree and seeing what's underneath? That's inquiry. And I'd be saying to them, inquiry is a matter of you as the educator being an inquirer, you noticing, watching, slowing down, and finding the opportunity to support children to then investigate the things that they become curious about. The lovely thing, of course, about being out in the environment is that we don't have to fabricate some kind of elaborate provocation, because the earth, the world, the environment around us is the provocation. I would be saying to those teachers, let's see what happens when we take these kids out and let's watch, and then we talk about what are some of the concepts that are living in this moment. You know, I know you and I share a love of birds, Kevin. And
absolutely.
I went for a walk yesterday, and at the moment I'm in an urban environment, and there's a family of magpies at the end of my street. They've been there. There's like 4 or 5. They're typically a group of magpies, would be around about 4 or 5, and they're just near the train station, and they hang out and they make their beautiful. Do you know the sound of an Australian magpie, Kevin?
I've seen them on YouTube videos. That's all. But I've heard them.
They are just extraordinary birds, and you'll see them in most school grounds. You know, well, maybe not most, but I'm going to put it out there. If not magpies, there'll definitely be seagulls. There'll be probably horrible little Indian miners. There'll be noisy miners. There'll be lots of urban birds. We take kids into that environment. I'd be saying to those teachers, let's watch, or even just let's watch these birds for a little while. And I was watching these magpies yesterday on my walk, and I was thinking about this podcast, and I was asking myself that question: what are the concepts that live here? And I actually scribbled them down when I came home, and I went, okay, diversity, change, community, relationships, adaptation, pattern, beauty, migration, habitat, cycles, and in particular, this group of magpies, power dynamics. Now, I've been working on an inquiry with some grade 6 kids at the moment, where we're looking at power, and we're looking at in relation to the government and how the government systems work around the world. And I'm looking at these magpies and the way they exercise power, who gets that worm, you know.
Yeah.
And I would be saying to these teachers, pretty much everything that I want kids to learn about is right there. It's right there in front of you. Let's watch, let's find the concepts that live here, and let's build the teaching out of that. That takes a bit of practice, but it's so rich with potential, and that if we give kids just a little more of an opportunity to become curious, and curiosity it's a muscle. We do need to use it, otherwise we lose it. And getting kids outdoors is a great way to strengthen that curiosity muscle. And once we've got curiosity, our teaching is so much easier, right?
Yeah.
We're not forcing it. We're going with the natural grain of the brain that is hungry to find out. So that is a long answer where I managed to throw in some birds into it. And I will find other ways to get birds into other answers.
Birds are important. Birds are definitely important. And I think that's one of the first things that, like, I can remember when it was a long time ago when I did meet you in person, though. I think I tried to talk to you. I talked to you for a few minutes about birds because that's something that I met you in Beijing, and magpies were actually one of the few varieties that were around our school. So when I was running a nature lunchtime club, there wasn't a lot of biodiversity around our schoolyard, but there were a lot of Eurasian magpies, and my students became experts on them because that's what we had. And that, ironically enough, we talk about that curiosity. You can find it anywhere. And ironically enough, when my son, who's now 12 years old, when people ask him, and this happened in one of his humanities classes the other day, they were asked, what is your favorite animal? His favorite animal is the rock dove, what some might call the lowly pigeon. He loves them. And we have a huge story connected to that, a very deep story about, like, during COVID times when we had left China and the borders were closed and we were living in Airbnbs in Japan for 9 months. We were bopping around as we kept getting kicked out of Airbnbs. But the one thing we always had were little urban parks in Osaka, Japan that had lots of rock doves. And for those out there, that's a proper name for pigeons. And we would sit and watch them for hours a day. And my son got to understand. He would recognize which ones were in which flock, and he would watch them, and he named them. And we would go back each day hoping that he would see the certain ones. And it got and he started researching and reading more and more about them. And he just loves rock doves. And I love that he loves them. And you
just described the perfect arc of inquiry, Kevin. You know, the natural provocation, the time spent observing, slowing down, wondering, connecting, then the curiosity, then the investigation, and then the commitment, the action. Yeah. This is the commitment. I am now invested in this. I understand. I have this deep understanding. And of course, we know that little journey into the rock dove can then connect to a wider care for the environment and a wider understanding of some of those very concepts that live inside that experience for him. It's a beautiful story.
Oh, yeah. No, I love it. And it's interesting, just kind of backtracking for a moment when I had mentioned, you gave it a fantastic answer, by the way. And when we talked about, when I mentioned educators saying, what's all this inquiry stuff? It kind of reminds me that when a lot of the people that I've met in my environmental education courses are passionate, and they are getting children outside every day and doing wonderful things. And sometimes I think it's a matter of we just don't know. Teachers just might not know the language.
That's it. Yeah.
So, for example, when we start studying as an educator a new literacy program, and you're hearing all these terminologies coming in, and we're having our planning meetings, we've done our PD on Zoom, and we've done this and that, and we realize, wait a second, and we're overwhelmed at first, and we're anxious, and we realize we are doing this. I have been doing this. I do have a balanced literacy program in my classroom. I just didn't call it this. Or I didn't call that aspect. Yeah. It has a different name. And once that kind of it's a bit demystified, you realize, oh wait, okay, this isn't so bad. Yeah. I'm kind of on the right track.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's, it reminds me a little bit of that very elegant thinking routine of Ron Richard and Mark Church's work, the Connect, Extend, Challenge. So let's find what it is that we're already doing and being that connect with this idea. I'm already engaging children. Am I getting them outdoors? Am I listening to their questions? Are we spending time observing? Are we researching the things we're interested in? Oh, hang on, I can really connect. I am actually doing something. Then, so, okay, what might I add to it? Because I think the only danger with that idea of, oh, we're already doing it, is that can then become a bit of an excuse to not stretch yourself any further. So it's like, what am I connecting with? How can I nudge this forward a little, and then acknowledging what's challenging in this for me and why, and what might I need to do with that sense of challenge. But I think you're right, finding initially at least the relationship between what we're already doing and then this new idea. And for people that are passionate about the environment, my hunch is if they're already taking kids out and they're not being too didactic in the way that they do that, they're not having a line of kids, in pairs marching behind them while they say, now, girls and boys, if you just get your notepads out and observe what we see here, this tree is, if they're not doing that, but they're rather allowing the kids to get excited, then they're already engaging in inquiry.
Nice. Which leads me into, the idea of what advice would you have, or what would you say to those educators who are maybe, of course, we're not all passionate about the environment. We're not all passionate about nature. I often tend to find that I'm one of the more passionate ones in the room, where I'm often at schools called the bug guy because I love bugs as well. And I'm not saying that I want to see more bug guys and bug gals beside me. I'm not expecting people to want to dive into a bush as an adult to grab a mantis. I'll take that role, sure. But obviously, if we want to connect,
I'll fight you for it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Luckily you're there. You can't get the mantises I have. But mind you, you're in Australia. You've probably got way more cool bugs and everything else nature-wise. But to have passionate kids or to connect kids with nature, we obviously have to have educators who have an understanding and have some sort of interest or passion for those city teachers. Because a lot of us are in a very urban environment. For those who feel, kind of look out the door and never really thought about it, like, well, there's not much nature here. How am I supposed to connect kids with nature? My school's downtown. How am I supposed to do this? What would you suggest, or what advice would you give to teachers to kind of spark a little bit of the interest under them that hopefully they can then carry on into their classrooms?
Yeah, it's really interesting you asked that question. I was actually planning an inquiry pretty much around the concept of connection to place with some Year 5-6 teachers a few weeks ago. And one of the things we really wanted the kids to understand was the way that Indigenous ways of living with place can help us learn more about places, or something like that. Mm-hmm. So I am going to answer your question. One of the things I noticed as we were talking was that really I felt like, it's not an area I know a lot about, but I know a bit about it, but I certainly knew a lot more than the group of teachers I was working with. And I thought, we're swimming around in a collective pool of ignorance here. We need to engage with people that have that expertise. And so what we've ended up doing, and again, this was my role to bring this to them. I was talking about this place. It's called the Yuyangs. It's 3 really amazing kind of rocky mountains that erupted. They're basically just the only kind of elevated bit of land on a long stretch of drive, and it's only about 45 minutes away from the school. None of the teachers knew what I was talking about. Like, what are they? Where are they? I'm going, you would have driven past it on the horizon? No? Okay. Long story short, they're going there next week. And so we arranged this whole trip. We arranged someone like a ranger that can meet them there, who understands the Indigenous history of the area. And I've really encouraged them to go before they take their kids so that they can have that connection. So I think I think you do need people like you in schools. You need, if you haven't got the knowledge base, and that's true for lots of things that we want the kids to inquire into, we do need to have a bit of background knowledge ourselves. So finding the people that might know about that. So, if there's a spider on the classroom wall, classic moment often is in an Australian school, and it absolutely freaks you out and all you want to do is spray it with bug spray and kill it, but at least you know that that's not the best idea. Find someone on staff that is going to be cool with it, that might know a little bit about it, because you will have kids that will be totally engrossed by that, and that's your perfect opportunity for an inquiry. Find your experts, learn about it through them. I think we have to find those people in our community. And if it's not in your teaching community, it might be in your parent community. But it's not, I would argue, it's not like other things where you can choose. I can choose not to know much about football, Kevin. I don't know anything about football. And it's not probably going to be a massive, the consequence of me choosing not to connect with football is fine. The consequence of us choosing not to connect with the natural environment that is the source of our survival and the survival of the generations that come after us, that's a huge thing. I think there's an imperative for us to at the very least say, look, I don't know much about this. I wouldn't have a clue what birds there are in our school ground. Who could I talk to that might know about this, or who could I get to come and talk to my kids? One thing we know is that curiosity is contagious, right? Sorry to use that word, that's probably inappropriate in these times. Infectious? No. Anyway, that it's catching. No. Yeah.
It's catching on. Yes.
So I have to watch half an episode of anything David Attenborough does, right? Yeah. And, you're halfway through his amazing episode on termites, and it's like, oh, man, termites are amazing. And that's because he is so passionate about what he does. So find those passionate people in your community. Go watch them, David Attenborough, connect with the people. That's what switched me on to environmental education. Apart from my own childhood, it was being taken by a very, very savvy lecturer when I was in my final year of teacher education. And she took us, I was studying early childhood education at the time. She took our group to the Melbourne Zoo. The Melbourne Zoo had and still has a world-leading education centre. There's a school in the zoo, the zoo school that schools come to. And I walked in, and this young man, Frank Ryan, was one of the teacher educators there. And he sat us in a circle and he brought out a corn snake, and we ended up passing it around while Frank talked about how beautiful this creature was. And I was as mesmerised by Frank as I was by the snake. And I just thought, I want to give kids this feeling. I want that. I mean, he took us on this most magical journey through the zoo. Frank ended up becoming one of our dearest friends. He and my husband started a company called Vox Bandicoot, the voice of the bandicoot, which was an endangered species here, and took animals and environmental theatre around to schools for 5 years. And I learned so much from Frank, who sadly left this world 3 years ago, suddenly and terribly. But what Frank taught me was that you can connect kids to the environment simply by modelling, by showing them your authentic passion for and love for and connection with nature. And it just draw kids in just by saying, isn't this beautiful? Oh my goodness, let's just take a moment. Look at those beautiful shiny scales. Have you ever seen? So I've learned to do that. I mean, it's in me anyway. I'm just saying it out loud.
Yeah.
So, I think we need people to do that for teachers.
Yeah.
We need teachers to have strong, connected experiences. Let's get teachers out into nature for our professional learning experiences. And I'm raving on, but I think that's where we build that's where we build the understanding, because you do need that. You need the understanding that this is I am connected to that magpie.
Yeah.
That's not just, that's just a bird. That is my connection to life. And pretty important, I'd say.
Yeah, right. That's wow, a lot there. Thank you. That was wonderful. So many things were popping through my mind while you were talking about that. I thought about, people over the years have asked me, Kevin, why are you interested in birds? Why do you want to show kids about birds? And I always say, because they're everywhere. That's one of the beautiful things about birds. No matter where you are in the world, if you're in Beijing, if you're in Melbourne, if you're in Sydney, Nova Scotia, Canada, or Sydney, Australia, there are birds that are different and neat and interesting, and the kids can see them. But yeah, connecting adults with nature. And that's one thing that I'm hoping in the future I can do more of that. I've tried in the past. COVID regulations here in China have slapped that down several times. But in the past, I've tried to do, I have done a few nature walks in local parks. And I can remember saying, I want to do this for staff. And they're like, can we bring our kids? I'm like, not for this one. Let's not for this one. I do lots of work with kids, but that's not who I want to bring outside to show the diversity on a tree. Right now, I want to do this for you, so you can take it back. So I want to do more work with adults, and I really appreciate that. Often, some of my wonderful colleagues, they want to bring their kids along and stuff, but then it's kind of not the goal for those particular sessions. I would like to do,
It's really important. And I feel like there's not, I don't know. I mean, as I say, I started this work a long time ago. And one of my mind-blowing experiences was doing an earth education camp with the extraordinary Steve Van Mater, that was the father of earth education. And it was that, it was giving us as adults these experiences that we could, and then I used it so much with kids after that. And it was little things like, his idea of magic spots, where you would just go and find your spot in nature and sit there for extended periods each day, 5 minutes, then 7 minutes, then 9 minutes, just noticing. And then you got really connected to this one little spot. That's my spot, over the course of the week. Or another one, which was this beautiful thing. I can't remember the name of the strategy, but you would find a leaf, any leaf that fall on the ground, and then he had this whole beautiful story about the colours on the leaves, and then you would walk around the area that you were in and try and find other things in that area that matched one of the colours in the leaf exactly. So it forced you to look at these tiny little pieces of colour, and suddenly you realise just how many millions of greens there are, for example. So I think those experiences, and then I've done that with kids ever since, those experiences as teachers, if we can be given the opportunity to be guided through learning experiences in the outdoors, we're much more likely then to feel confident with doing it with kids, because a lot of it is just a lack of confidence, I think, as well as just basic knowledge.
Yeah. So you hear that, teachers, it's getting outside and not having to be an expert. I think a lot of people are intimidated by that. They feel that they need to be an expert, and that's not something they need to be. They don't need to be the bird expert or the biodiversity expert at all. I think it's just a matter of being open to taking the kids outdoors and to letting them explore and be curious, right?
Yeah, but reconnect. I mean, it was interesting, certainly, I don't know about in China, but in Australia, especially where I am in Melbourne, during lockdown, the one thing we were allowed to do is we were allowed to go on walks. And I've heard so many people talk about that experience, that they found nature and spending. And when I say nature, I'm talking about there's a local creek nearby that it's kind of full of weeds, but it's still, there's some beautiful moments in it. And people were hungry to connect with the outdoors because they were locked up. And I think for some people that was a real awakening of just how powerful it was to spend time in nature. So, it might just be that. I mean, it might be, let's if the weather is okay, let's go and have our staff meeting outdoors. Or if I'm just meeting with a team, why don't we go on a walking meeting? Yeah. And I think just that then there's people much more informed than me about this. There's a whole walking curriculum, I think, that comes out of Canada. That is amazing. So there's a lot you can learn from people in this field of environmental education that is really straightforward to apply.
Fantastic. Thank you. You know what, Kath? I don't want to keep you much longer because I also I have to get ready for work. You've got more work today. I do.
Yeah.
So you've got a new book out. It's on the Twitter. It's all over the place. You've got Getting Personal with Inquiry Learning. I was wondering if you could take a moment to tell the listeners a little bit about that. I always like to have people tell us a little bit about what they're doing.
Oh, thank you. Yes. So Getting Personal with Inquiry is, as it sounds, is all about providing opportunities for our young learners to inquire into the things about which they are passionate, and also about helping them find things about which they can be passionate, whether that's their skills or whether that's knowledge about things. So it's really supporting teachers often to ramp up their inquiry learning work to the next level. Yeah. And it does mean that our little budding David Attenboroughs get their opportunity. Those kids that go, I just want to know more about snakes, they get the opportunity to do that. So there's a nice connection there. You know, it's interesting when I look back, the very first book that I wrote, and I've written many now, but the first one that I wrote was called Integrating Naturally. And it was about how to design integrated curriculum around big ideas from the natural world. And so it's really lovely looking back at integrating naturally and then looking forward at this book about following your passions as a learner, and see that thread of connection, passion for the earth, passion for learning, started way back then. So yeah, I'm really I'm happy with the way the book's been received, and I hope it gives both teachers and children a stronger sense of permission to take those unexpected pathways.
Nice. Thank you so much. And of course, folks, where can they find you online? Where are some of the places?
All the things. Twitter. I'm at KJ Inquiry on Twitter and Instagram. Facebook page is Kath Murdoch Consulting. I'm on LinkedIn, but I always forget to look at that. So sorry if you've messaged me. And I do have a blog, although I blog less often these days because I find the Instagram posts and the Facebook posts are kind of like that's taken over the blogging maybe. But I also have a newsletter, and I reckon pretty much every newsletter there'll be some resource that is connected to the environment. In fact, I know others can't see us, but I'm just going to show you what I recently bought, which is this book here. And for those of you listening, it's called What Birds Teach Us.
I took a screen capture of that. Oh, wow.
So good. Every page is about the characteristics of different birds and the relationship between those characteristics and human behaviour. It looks amazing. So that'll be on the newsletter.
Fantastic. So, yeah, I just actually had on a recent episode of the podcast, I had Nate Swick, who is the host of the American Birding Podcast. And I was really excited because although we're talking about birds, he was kind of a big fish for me. It was really exciting because the American Birding Podcast, although I'm not in that area of the world, he's just such an engaging host, and he's a young host, and he brings on a lot of young, engaging birders. And one of the conversations we had is about the changing face of birding in North America. There's a lot of diversity coming into the hobby and the passion. A lot of younger people, and the pandemic is one of the things they talked about. It we talked about pandemic birding and pandemic birders, and a lot of people, that's what they call themselves. Oh, I'm a pandemic birder. Like those walks that you talked about, people getting out into nature. A lot of people discovered birds, and that's fantastic. So I suppose silver linings, right?
You can learn. Absolutely. And you don't have to be, I wouldn't consider myself at all to be like a proper birder, or what do they call? Yeah. A Twitcher. Twitcher. God, I had a moment. Yeah. I'm not that. But there is something about that as a portal into understanding the way that the world works.
Yeah.
And as you say, they are everywhere, like people are everywhere.
Mm.
So, that it's a way into connecting with nature. And take your kids out, whether you've got an urban environment or a more natural environment, get your kids outside and just say, let's just watch them.
Yeah.
Let's watch these seagulls, which are in a lot of our schools here, and see what we notice. And you watch and listen to the questions start to bubble up, and
Nice.
the inquiry begins.
Well, I'm always excited to get my kids outside. And one of the great things is this morning I've got recess duty. And one of the interesting things a teacher apparently said to my TA last week was my teaching assistant had duty at a certain time. And a teacher said, why is Mr. O'Shea outside? He doesn't have duty right now. And what I was doing is we were collecting Asian tramp snails. They're called, these cute little snails off of trees. And about a dozen children got to hold a snail for the first time. I taught them that they're not scary. So I had them holding up their hands and putting snails, and the snails are crawling around, and the kids are like,
ah! Oh, beautiful. And did they have lots of questions? And did you come back in and start to investigate and blah, 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 blah? No, I'm getting all excited.
It goes on and on.
Inquiry.
Yeah, it's lovely. It's lovely. But Kath, thank you so much for coming on the Nature Talks podcast. I really appreciate it. And hopefully we can do it again in the future.
Amazing. And thank you for a podcast that is so important. I really think that this is a time more than any that we need to ensure that we stay connected. I'm going to say it again. This planet that we live on, our little spaceship floating out there, this tiny little blue marble is the reason we're all here, and we need to look after it. So thank you.
Well put. Thank you so much. Of course, I want to thank Kath for taking the time out of her busy schedule to come on the Nature Talks podcast and share her passion for nature, wildlife, conservation, and all of those fantastic things. Of course, you can find her over at kathmurdoch.com.au. She's all over social media. You can check out her books, her everything, and there will be links in the show notes. I want to thank everyone who has come over to the Nature Talks podcast Facebook page. It's growing. And I want to thank all of you who've come over to the page to follow us, facebook.com/Nature Talks podcast. Thank you for supporting us. I want to thank anyone who's come over to our Instagram at instagram.com/SheZenWildlife. SheZenWildlife. All of these links will be below in the show notes, all that stuff under the under the podcast information. If you listen to us in Google Podcasts or Amazon Music or Apple Podcasts, you'll see all the links right there. So, and of course, come on over and follow me on Twitter at MadForMaple. I would really appreciate it. So one more thing before we go with this episode of the podcast. Again, please share this podcast with educators that you know. Share this podcast in any Facebook groups that you're a part of that are connected with outdoor education, environmental education, just education in general, climate action, because these are things we need to make these connections with people around the world. So help us grow that way. And now to one more thing, I want to spread the word about a brand new podcast that I'm doing with my son, with my 12-year-old son. And this podcast, I'm kind of taking a back seat. He's really the driver in this podcast. He's a passionate young historian, and this podcast is called the Who Knew World War II podcast. He is very passionate with keeping the history of World War II alive for people to know. He is very fascinated in the topic and extremely knowledgeable. And we come from a family of military historians, believe it or not. You probably didn't know that. I'm not a military historian, but I grew up in the house with one. My dad, the best dad in the world. And my son Kai is teaching me in this podcast about various aspects of World War II, I should say. So I'll add some links to the show notes as well. It's a brand new podcast, so it doesn't really pop up when you search for it as of yet. We've got one episode out about the Battle of Midway, a very different topic, but there will be new episodes coming out. And this podcast is really focused on history education. It's focused on history teachers out there to share with their students. So it's a history podcast by a young historian for young historians and students. So the Who Knew World War II podcast. Please go check that out. I'd I'd be forever grateful if you subscribe to that too. And if you're a fan of history, if you are a history teacher or you know some people who are history teachers, please share it with them. All right, guys. Well, that's it for this podcast, this episode number 16. I'll be taking the week off next week. Just to line up the ducks, so to speak. We've got another fantastic podcast episode coming out after this. In a couple of weeks, I'll be talking with Jody Green, who is a fantastic scientist, entomologist at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, and she's going to talk to us a lot about the importance of insects and biodiversity. Another fantastic episode. So that's it for me, Kevin O'Shea, your host. I hope you're doing well wherever you are. Remember to check all those show notes. Remember to leave a review and like us in iTunes, I should say Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen, and help support the show. Wherever you are in the world, I hope you're happy, I hope you're healthy, and I'll be talking to you again really soon.